I kind of went into this prediction, Ryan, and I said to myself, look, I'm just going to go with my heart on this one. That's kind of what I said was like all summer. I'm just going to go with my heart on this one and have some fun with it. But honestly, the more I break the game down statistically, schematically, personnel wise, what was lost, what's coming back, who's stepping into certain spots, who I think is going to make a jump from on both teams. It really to me comes down to looking at past trends. It really comes down to my pick, I believe, is one that I can base off of matchups and scheme and players and those type of things. And my prediction for this game is Notre Dame 34, Ohio State 26. Basically, how I see it going down is both teams score 6 times. The difference in the game is Notre Dame has 4 touchdowns and 2 field goals. Ohio State has 2 touchdowns and 4 field goals. That's how I see it. I think Ohio State has been a team over the years that has not really come out of the gate great at home for whatever reason. I think part of it is they are such a pass-heavy offense that can kind of take some time to get going compared to a team that just comes out and runs it and can run it down your throat. In the years that Ohio State did come out well early, they were years where they were a really strong running team. Now, maybe this team is that, but we'll have to find that out. But I have it, to me, Ryan, I think the Notre Dame defense is going to be able to make enough stops in the red zone to force field goals in those condensed field situations. And I think the opposite is true on the other side. I think Notre Dame's going to punch it in, and I think Notre Dame's going to start off really fast and then have to hold on. I do think that's how the game is going to play out. And when I look at it, I kind of see it, Ohio State scores to make it 31-26. Notre Dame kind of goes on a long time-consuming drive at the end of the game, kicks a field goal to go up 8, and then Ohio State doesn't have enough time to kind of get another one in there. So that's how I see the game playing out for me, Ryan. So before we kind of predict game balls, that's how I see this one playing out. What is your prediction, and how do you see the game playing out?
Brian, we see this game pretty similarly, I think. I mean, I was just looking at my score prediction that was in the piece that you posted today about the game prediction, and my last 2 sentences are word for word. Notre Dame got off to a fast start before Ohio State mounted a comeback in the fourth quarter. The Irish are able to hold them off at the end and escape the opener with a tremendous victory. So I also agree. I think Notre Dame has the chance, and they have to, and we talked about this yesterday, get off to a fast start. I think they have to. And I think they do that by coming out and being so much more physical than they were last year. If there's one thing about Notre Dame that I believe this year, it's that they are going to be a much more physically impressive football team just from a play style perspective. I expect the offensive line, the significance of the run game and implementation of the run game. I think that Notre Dame is going to come out and they're going to punch them in the face a little bit, and I know Ohio State eventually is going to punch back, which is why I kind of said like they're going to mount a little bit of a comeback here. They're going to get back to this football game because, again, Ohio State's a really good team, right?
Oh,
yeah. We've been talking about this all week. This is not going to be a one-sided affair, in my opinion. I would be surprised.
I'd be shocked.
If
either way.
Team.
Either way.
100%. Right. No matter who wins this football game, I would be very surprised if it was just like a rollover. I would be very, very surprised in that fact. So I had Notre Dame 34, Ohio State 31. I talked on the show yesterday, the day before that. I think 31 is kind of the number for Ohio State. If you have 31 or less, I feel good about Notre Dame's chances. If it starts getting into the mid-high 30s or into the 40s, I think that Notre Dame doesn't have much of a chance in that type of affair. So I think Notre Dame comes out strong, they come out fast, and they're able to hold off the Buckeyes for a 3-point victory at the end.
That's how I see it. Now, here's the other prediction I have, Ryan, and I'm not sure. I think you said the same thing. But here's one thing that I'm more confident in my next prediction than I am in the score of this game. I'm not going to lie. I'm not super confident in the prediction of this game. I'm not. Why? Because Ohio State's really good. You're going on the road against the number 2 team in the country. I personally would not have Ohio State number 2. I would have them number 3. It ain't a big difference. You know my stance, Ryan. Georgia's number 1 until somebody beats them. They just are. I think Alabama has more coming back on both sides of the ball, and they were better than Ohio State last year, so they're coming from a better starting point. And I actually think Nick Saban made some really good moves this offseason with some guys that left. I think the O-line hire is going to be huge for them this year. I'm just a believer that you're the champ until somebody beats you. I said the same thing about LSU in 2020. I say the same thing about Georgia now. Now, LSU obviously proved to not be the champ pretty quickly early that season, but that's just how I feel, right? So this is a really darn good football team. Really darn good football team in Ohio State. It's just when I look at it, I think Notre Dame matches up really well with them. And if you're an Ohio State fan and you're being objective, you can look at our prediction and say, I think you guys are wrong, and Ohio State's going to win this game. Totally fine. But if you don't understand why we came to this, then I don't think that you really have a legitimate understanding of who your football team is and some of the own questions that you have to figure out. Now, part of our prediction is projecting that Notre Dame will improve in areas, because if we're banking on Notre Dame running the football, well, if you watched Notre Dame last year, they weren't really good at running the football. So there's projection on both sides. Fair. It's just when I look at the areas that Notre Dame has to get better in, I'm more confident that they're going to be able to make a quicker adjustment than some of the areas that Ohio State has to make improvements in, which leads me to my big prediction.
Okay.
The loser of this game does not lose another regular season game. The loser of this game will run the table, and it does not matter who it is, because I actually think Ohio State fans are not going to like this. I actually think getting smacked in the mouth a little bit in the opener is going to be really good for Ohio State. And if I'm being honest, if my prediction is correct that both of these teams are going to run the table, I kind of almost want Notre Dame to not win this game. Bear with me here, because if Notre Dame runs the table and Ohio State beats Notre Dame, I don't see Ohio State losing but one game all year. If that, they could easily go 13-0, because I think Notre Dame's the only team that, and especially after watching Penn State last night, Penn State's not beating Ohio State. So I my stance on rematches, Ryan. I think it's hard to win a rematch. And so if I have this belief that Notre Dame, Ohio State are really going to roll the rest of the way, I kind of want to be the team that's got something to prove in the rematch. But, that actually made me think a little bit about picking Ohio State in this game. But I just really feel like the trench play, I think, is going to favor Notre Dame. I think that the other aspect of it, too, is I think Notre Dame knows a lot more about Ohio State than Ohio State knows about Notre Dame. No matter what you think, what Ohio State's offense is going to look like, and you just studied 12 games in preparation for a bowl game of what Jim Knowles is going to do. Now, is there a change in how that's going to look under the current personnel? Yes, but this is the second time this Notre Dame coaching staff has had to prepare for and Tommy Rees especially, has had to prepare for a Jim Knowles team. Actually, first time Tommy Rees has done it. But Notre Dame also had to prepare for Duke in the past. So when he was the D coordinator at Duke. So they're going to know a lot about Jim Knowles. I don't know what the heck Al Golden is going to do defensively.
Right.
Nobody does, right? And so to me, I don't know what Tommy Rees's offense is necessarily going to look like with this current coaching staff, because he has run two distinctly different offenses the last 2 years out of necessity. They didn't have weapons in the pass game in 2020, mainly at quarterback. Last year they had a quarterback, but they didn't have the offensive line. So we're projecting a lot of things, and that's another thing that factored into this decision for me, Ryan.
It's what gives me the most hope, I think, Brian, or the most the reasoning for why I kind of feel the way I do. It's because, like you just mentioned, right? There's new coaches on both sides of the coin here. One person, though, that we know very well is Harry Hiestand. He's
Right.
one guy that we have literally, it's not that he's done this at other places. He's coming in here to put his touch on the program. He's literally done this at Notre Dame before, right? Like, he's literally come in and improved trench play almost immediately. While on the other side, again, Jim Knowles, I love Jim Knowles, man. I think he's a really good defensive coordinator. But the fact of the matter is that his track record tells you there's an adjustment period there, right? Harry Hiestand doesn't say that. Harry Hiestand says the minute that he takes over a team, the offensive line is going to be better. And if they're better than they were last year, then I think, I know they're going to be better than they were last year. If they're significantly better than they were last year, then I think they have a chance to win the trenches on both sides of the football. I do. And I know people, PFF graded Ohio State as the number one offensive line in college football. Sure, guys. I'll say this, though. I've watched quite a bit of Ohio State's offensive line last year. Yeah. I'm not buying it. I'm just not buying it right now. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they're way better. Justin Frye, I'd like as an offensive line coach for sure, but we'll see. We'll see about how that kind of lines up. But
I'm gonna say this, Ryan.
Yeah.
This is part of the issue for me. in evaluating this game is there's a different conversation for me for what Ohio State is going to be and what Ohio State is going to be on September 3rd. And this is my whole thing is with Harry, there's kids that on this roster that Harry has coached. There's coaches that have coached with Harry before, and there's several guys in the lineup that Harry recruited as well. I mean, he recruited Andrew Kristofic, he recruited Zeke Correll, he recruited Josh Lugg. There's a little bit of a difference there, and so, for me, when I look at this too, is I think Ohio State offensive line wise should not be the number one offensive line in the country right now in PFF. I would argue that Notre Dame also shouldn't be number two because both of them have a lot to prove. Look, Michigan's got 3 guys coming back and they got in this center from transfer. They're the defending Joe Moore Award winner. I can't justify having Notre Dame and Ohio State ahead of them. I can't right now. It's just that I think Notre Dame is going to get to that point faster than Ohio State will. But I do think by the end of the year, we are going to see that because I do like Ohio. I think I like their town a little bit more than you do. I like Donovan Jackson quite a bit coming out of high school. I think he's a guard, not a tackle. So I like that move. I never thought he was a tackle coming out of high school. I think he's a better guard. I think Luke Whippler is exactly what you'd expect from an undersized kid from New Jersey to be. I think Matthew Jones is a tough, try-hard kid. He's not as athletic as some of the guys they've had. He's not as maybe physically gifted as some of the other players they've had. Mm-hmm. Man, you made a good point in your breakdown of him. That kid plays hard. So I think he's going to bring some toughness that I think at times last year they just did not have. And having them consistently in the lineup instead of coming in and out like he did last year, I don't think that that's where they're going to be. So I do think by the end of the year, Ohio State's going to be a top 5 offensive line. I don't think they're going to be better than Notre Dame's, but I do think they're going to be a top 5 offensive line. I'm just not necessarily buying it in game 1.
Right.
And also partly because I do think, again, there's a reason why the pass game takes longer to develop than the run game, because it requires so many more moving parts, literally. That includes pass protection, right? And so I think that's another area that I think where when you look at this, Notre Dame is going to have an opportunity to kind of enforce their will on them. And Ohio State fans get real upset about this, but look at the games you lost last year. Look at the games that were competitive last year. They were games the other team came in and punched you in the mouth. And so they've got to prove that they can play well in those type of games as well. And let's be honest, Ohio State has not done that a whole lot the last few years. Even Clemson, that was the knock we had on Clemson in 2020. This is not the Clemson teams of the past. This is Trevor Lawrence and a bunch of which is why you and I both predicted Clemson's descent last year, because we knew that Trevor Lawrence covered a lot of warts that existed on that team. This wasn't the 2018 Clemson team, which is why Notre Dame beat them. Because if it would have been the 2018 Clemson team, Notre Dame doesn't beat them in 2020. And so I just think that they've got some things they got to work out, just like Notre Dame's got some things they got to work out. And I'm not ready to give them the benefit of the doubt that everybody else seems to be willing to give them, because they have, to me, as many warts as Notre Dame does. I just think Notre Dame matches up better against Ohio State than they might against some other teams. For example, I think they match up better against Ohio State than they do Georgia right now because of Notre Dame's unprovenness on the perimeter. I just think that a team that's really good in the trenches, like I'd expect Georgia to be, would be a better matchup for them. I just think Notre Dame's going to have a chance to go out there and dominate in the trenches, and they're going to, I think, surprise some people with the speed that they have on offense. I think that's going to be the biggest surprise for me on this football team.
I'm so upset that I'm intellectually dishonest. Sorry,
I'm sorry. That person's gone.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That took me back for a second, because again, it's just I can't project Notre Dame to get better and also have some concern.
Dude, let's not even waste our time on that. I'm booting all the Ohio State fans. I'm not going to let them drag our show down. All right.
I know. So it's frustrating. It's a little
It's
frustrating.
all good.
But
it's all good.
Look, and you kind of reiterated a lot of and kind of expanded on it, Brian. My biggest thing is that I think, especially the Harry Hiestand hire, I think that there is a easier projection for early success with a couple of Notre Dame hires comparative to the Ohio State hires. Again, I would not want to play Ohio State at the end of the season, because if they get the offensive line figured out, if they get the defense starting to trend in the right direction, then they are I mean, any team in the country is going to have a tough time beating
Right.
them. Like, not just Notre Dame, like Alabama and the best of the best are going to have a tough time beating an Ohio State team if the offensive line is improved and their defense is up to snuff, right? Like, and there is talent. There is. Ohio State could get better. I just personally think that it's a little more likely that a Harry Hiestand coached offensive line is better in game one than a Justin Fry coached offensive line.
But here's the thing that frustrates me with some of these comments is if there's a lack of objectivity here, I believe. And the lack of objectivity is you're assuming that Ohio State's going to make improvements that Notre Dame is not. But what you're not acknowledging is that the baseline for Notre Dame is higher on defense than it is for Ohio State. The baseline on the offensive line, in my opinion, is higher than it is for Ohio State. And then it comes down to what I said before, the knowns versus the unknowns. Mm-hmm. That's the point. And so there's this, like, somebody, one of the Notre Dame fans, you've said this, like, Notre Dame's got to prove to me they can win these games. Fair, very 100%, fair. We talked about that for like 30 minutes at the beginning. But here's the difference. The conversation was, I think this Notre Dame team is good, but they just have too many unknowns. And I'm thinking, with all due respect, there's more unknowns on Ohio State's roster right now than there are on Notre Dame's. Mm-hmm. Again, there's an assumption, well, we don't know what Notre Dame is going to be a wide receiver. Yeah, we kind of do, more so, I think, than Ohio State, because Notre Dame does have a star pass catcher, just like Ohio State has a star pass catcher. His name is Michael Mayer. Lorenzo Styles caught more passes last year than Marvin Harrison Jr. and Emeka Egbuka combined, right? I mean, that's the fact. That's a fact. Now,
and yet
they were playing behind. We know why it happened.
Sure.
The point is it happened. And so, you look at the secondary. Denzel Burke is a good player. He was not better than Cam Hart last year. He was not. Cam Brown was not better than Cam Hart last year. We know who Brandon Joseph is. Ryan thinks that Josh Proctor is going to be a good player. He hasn't shown it yet. He was okay in 2020, and he was hurt last year. So you think the linebackers are going to get better. We don't know. As bad as Notre Dame's linebackers were last year, they were still better than Ohio State's. I mean, that's the reality of it. So that's where you kind of come down to it and say, this is why we predict what we predict. It may not happen. It may, but this is where we're coming from. And if you can't at least say, I think you're wrong, but I understand where you're coming from, then I don't think we're having an honest conversation. So that's basically where my issue comes from.
Yeah. Yep. And again, it's just another, you talked about Emeka Egbuka and Marvin Harrison Jr.
Incredibly talented players.
Incredibly talented. I'm sure that they're both going to be really good football players, but why are we assuming that they're the next coming and Lorenzo Styles can't be the next guy, right? Like why I just don't understand why that assumption is made. And I understand, well, I do understand why, because Ohio State has done better at
that's the proven
talent.
track record part. Yep,
I get
exactly. Because look at Jackson last year. Jackson had like 10 catches for like 40, like 80 yards as a freshman in 2020. Yeah. And then boom, breaks out and does what he does. So, and our thing, Ryan, and I think we're on the same page here. It's not that we're saying that Marvin Harrison and Emeka aren't going to be really good this year. They are. It's the opposite of, you are assuming that Lorenzo Styles is not. And that's the difference. It's like the people say, well, your quarterback's never played before. Did you watch your quarterback last year at Ohio State? Tyler Buckner, how many yards did he have passing last year? 286? Is that what it was? I'm trying to find it here real quick. I think it was 286. Let me just find it here. I got it right here. Find it really quickly. Tyler Buckner had, let's see, last year passing the football. He had, in 2021, Tyler had 298 passing yards last year. That's 298 more passing yards than CJ Stroud had in his coming into his first year as a starter, right? So again, it's if you're gonna use something against Notre Dame, at least do it consistently with your own team, and don't act like, hey, if you're gonna say, well, Tyler Buckner hasn't proven it, but our unproven players are going to come out and be great, you're not having an honest conversation, and this is what our channel's about. You can disagree. We may be wrong. We're not perfect or infallible, but at least make a coherent, consistent argument. Don't say that Notre Dame can't win because they have unproven players and Ohio State is going to win because of their unproven players. And that's pretty much what we've seen. I think this is going to be a great game. I think that Ohio State by the end of the year, I think Ohio State by the end of September is going to be a tremendous team, to be completely honest with you. I just know what they're installing. Basically, here's what it comes down to. The change that they're making now is the one Notre Dame made a year ago. And if you remember, Notre Dame went to a really complex, diverse, multiple defense last year, going from Clark Lee, whose defense was pretty much just like, here's where you line up and here's what you do. And it was a pretty, I don't say it was simplistic because it wasn't. There were some complexities to it, but alignment assignment wise, Ryan, Clark Lee's defense wasn't super, super complex. And then you went to one, you're a 3-3-1, 3-3-5 on one snap, you're a 4-2 on another snap, you're moving here, you're moving there. And guess what happened? You gave up a lot of big plays early in the season to not very good football teams. Then by the end of the year, that Notre Dame defense was playing really well until the bowl game when the defensive coordinator was no longer the defensive coordinator, right? That's what I think Ohio State's going to go through, in my opinion. And it's going to take some time. Once they get there, they're going to be fine. But in the opener, I believe it's going to create some problems because we've seen this before. We saw it with Notre Dame last year. We've seen it in past years. It takes some time for teams to really get rolling when you're putting in the kind of complex system that Jim Knowles is putting in. I think he needs to put it in. It's what Ohio State needs to do to be successful. It's just going to take a little bit of time to get there. I mean, let's not forget, I mean, as good as Jeff Hafley was, in his 1 year there, it takes time. It takes time to get those things going. You're not playing Florida Atlantic in the opener. You're not playing Cincinnati and Indiana and Miami to start your season. You're playing Notre Dame first, right? And so I remember watching that Florida Atlantic game thinking, boy, if that quarterback for Florida Atlantic could complete a freaking pass, they've had a couple guys open. If you remember that, I don't know if you remember that game. They scored 21 points, but if I remember correctly, they weren't like really offensive points because they only had like 200 some yards of offense. But I just remember thinking like, boy, there's chances to be there because you're making that kind of change. Notre Dame is not making the big schematic changes that Ohio State is making. And those take time. And that's kind of the point that we're coming from.
And it's a great point because, I mean, also the simple fact of you have Marcus Freeman that's still on the staff, right? I mean, like, that's the biggest thing for me. It's like, I know some people push back and say you're also changing a defensive coordinator to kind of your talking point there, right? But it's also, yes, but the person that implemented the defense last year is still on the staff. So there's still going to be kind of conversation and ability to collaborate on that regard. Jim Knowles is starting from scratch. I mean, he's putting in a system. He's getting players used to it. I mean, and I think there's going to be a transitional period there. I think it's more likely that there is a bigger transitional period from Ohio State early on in the season defensively than there will be with Notre Dame. That's just all I believe. It's just why I believe it. So same thing with Justin Fry versus Harry Houston. It's the same exact thing.
That's going to end up being the best hire that Ryan Day made, in my opinion. When it's all said and done, I think Justin Fry, everybody's talking about Jim Knowles now. I think when it's all said and done, it's going to be Justin Fry is going to be the hire that people are going to be talking about at the end of the year. I do. And Ryan, we've known about Justin Fry for a long time.
Yeah.
Because we learned about him when Harry Houston left the first time. As we said this week, Justin Fry was one of the finalists for that job. And he was one of a couple guys that the Notre Dame players liked more than the guy that they hired. He ended up going to UCLA, and we saw the job he did there. So I know Jim Knowles gets it. Yeah, and I think Jim Knowles is a good defensive coordinator. I think you are a little higher on him than I am. I think a little bit, but we both think he's a good defensive coordinator. Sure. I think Justin Fry is a really good offensive line coach. I just think it's going to take him a little bit, just some time to get that thing going. But I think by the end of the year, by November, I'll say this, by the time they play Michigan, the hire that everyone is going to be talking about is going to be Justin Fry. That's my prediction for this team. I think that was because the thing I like about Justin Fry is his thing is he's a guy that believes in physicality. He's an old school, even though he's young, he's an old school line coach because he learned under Steve Adazio. I mean, I was told when he interviewed him, they were still using boards. Like his drills were still using boards. Like I didn't know anybody still use boards, right? Like that's how old school he was, even though he's a young guy. But it's a lot like Harry's philosophy of pad level, drive your feet, use your hands, finish, be physical. And Ohio State's offensive line, honestly, has been missing that for years. Even when they had J.K. Dobbins and, like some of the really good backs in recent years, Travion Henderson last year, their run game was more about scheme and talent than it was about just dominating people. Now, was it the 19 line or the 20 line that ran really well because they had big guys who could just move people, but they were moving people that just weren't that good. Was it 2019? Is that the year? Was that the year JK had 2,000? Yeah, it was 2019. It was JK's last year. JK Dobbins last year. Like they had Josh Myers, they had Wyatt Davis. You and I were talking about this yesterday.
Yeah, it was a physical line.
Right. And so but they had big guys. I don't think they were necessarily physical from a style of play standpoint. They were physical just because they were big.
They were huge.
And even then it's like, if you could put the kind of emphasis on just toughness that I think they needed, that's why I say because what's the one thing I've been saying all summer, and people say, man, I wish Notre Dame had a few games to warm up before playing Ohio State. What was my automatic answer every time? No, you don't. No, you don't. You don't want this team having 3 games as a warm up to get everything going. You just don't. And there's the aspect of you don't want them having 3 games of knowledge of what you do, because as I said, I do think we're going to see more changes when it comes to more uncertainty. Jack Cohn offense is not, and an Ian Book offense is not going to look the same as a Tyler Buckner offense. It's just not.
For sure.
So that's basically where I come down on it.
And I will echo your sentiment about Justin Fry, because I thought Fry did a tremendous job at UCLA. I really did. I think that, I mean, he's got some talent to work with. There's no doubt. It's just, again, you have Paris Johnson, who's going to be starting his first game at left tackle, Brian, right? Like he's been inside the last 2 years playing football. He's making his first start at left tackle.
Right side.
Right guard. I started every game at right guard last year. You have Donovan Jackson, who I think is slated to start right guard, if I remember correctly, who is a really talented player.
That one I don't know. Because
right or left.
I'm not sure, because like Matthew Jones has played both of them, and they haven't let anybody in. I was told you're right, but I don't. Mm-hmm. We're guessing a little bit because I don't think we know. And Ohio State doesn't release a depth chart.
Right. And so, I mean, so either way, Donovan Jackson's going to be starting somewhere for the first time ever, right? Like he has not started a game at Ohio State. You have Matthew Jones, who has only started 5 football games in his career. He started 2 games last season. And again, I know I'm critical of DeJuan Jones, because I think DeJuan Jones actually is pretty talented. And if he lost like 30 pounds, like people have been saying, that's fantastic. But all I know is last year, DeJuan Jones wasn't very good. I mean, if we're being completely honest with ourselves, right? So you have multiple guys that are starting at a new spot for the first time in general in a Donovan Jackson, and you had another right tackle that just wasn't very good last year. Now, if they put it all together, then sure, that offensive line is very talented. But the point is, we're talking about a first game situation. I'm not talking about game 10 when they've had all this time, or game 6 when they have all this time to have that cohesion together and do all that type of stuff. I'm talking about one game where there's a lot of moving parts, and there's also a new system that has been put into effect. So that's the only reason that I feel the way I do about that situation. I long-term, though, think Justin Fry is going to be fantastic for this offensive line. There's a reason that I've been talking about Paris Johnson all summer about potentially being a first-round pick and maybe a top 15 type of player when it's all said and done, because he has so much talent. I'm just talking about a game 1 difference comparative to a full season perspective.
So Archer says that Donovan's going to be on the left side, which honestly is where they should put him. Put the more athletic, my stance on this. Put your more athletic side on the left and your more big physical side on the right. That's how how I feel on that.
Matt Jones rotated in at right guard last year too, so that's good.
And he played some left too,
familiarity.
Right? Because I was at the Nebraska game. I think he actually started at left guard in place of Thayer Munford.
Sounds right.
At least early in the game, and so that's how I would do it. Again, I think athletic on the left, physical on the right. That's how I've always felt it. That's just it's not a right or wrong. It's just how I like it. So, but at the end of the day, all this talk about how good of a jump that Ohio State's going to make with those hires, it comes down to, that's where we're coming from. When it comes down to Notre Dame is I still feel even more confident in Harry Hiestand. And the fact is he is working with people he's worked with before. Him and Tommy Rees have worked together before as player, when Tommy was a player, and in 2017. The last time Tommy Rees, Matt Bayless, and Harry Hiestand were all on the same staff, Notre Dame won the Joe Moore Award. and ran for
Yep.
260 plus yards per game. So that's kind of where it comes down to.
Yeah,
So
I keep forgetting to mention Chris Watt too. Like that's not a big
right,
addition as well. You
right,
know, it's a
right.
massive addition. Yep.
So I hope it's a good game. Well, actually, that's not true. I only hope it's a good game if Notre Dame loses. For my at my age and for what my heart level and anxiety can take, Ryan, I don't necessarily want it to be a close game, but I would be shocked if Notre Dame spanks Ohio State.
Can you
I would be
imagine if
really
it came down
surprised.
to like a last second field goal for Blake Groupie? You would you would be losing your mind.
Hey Ryan, you guys handle the post game show without me. I'm going to be in the ER. So it's going to be good. We've had enough of that at Irish Breakdown. We'll talk a little bit about that here in a little bit. So, look, here's kind of where we're at, Ryan. So that's kind of our prediction for this game. If it plays out the way that we expect it to play out at the end of the game, who do you see as getting the game ball for Notre Dame? So, end of the game, your prediction comes true. Notre Dame wins 34-31. Who gets the game ball for Notre Dame?
Well, I mean, I almost wanted to split it up to an offensive and defensive one, right? Like my guy on offense was Tyler Buckner, and my guy on defense was Brandon Joseph. I'm going to give it to Tyler Buckner because he's in a big moment. And if they win this football game, I think it's going to be a lot of because they are able to strike a really nice balance offensively between the run and the pass. And I think that starts with the signal caller who has that ability to be a dual threat type of player. So I'm going to give it to Tyler Buckner. But again, I think defense, there's going to have to be a turnover or two if Notre Dame's able to come out with the victory. But I would opt to Tyler Buckner because I think the dual threat ability is going to be big for Notre Dame in this game.
Yeah. I think it's going to have to be that, or it's going to be somebody else that steps up with a big game, some big plays. Let's say a Braden Lindsey, a Lorenzo Styles, an Audric Estime, somebody along those lines is going to be could be that other person. So that's kind of how I see that one being. And to me, honestly, I could also see it being someone on defense. If, like I said, if there's 34-26, I think both teams score 6 times. Notre Dame holds them to more field goals. I could see somebody, somebody that we're not expecting, a Tariq Bracy, a Clarence Lewis, somebody like that kind of stepping up and making some big plays that help Notre Dame win this game. So that's kind of where I come down on that one. So those are